Hello, horror fans. You are listening to A Survivor's Guide to Horror, a film podcast dedicated to showing you how to survive horror movies. I'm your host, Em, and today I will be guiding you through the skills needed for Halloween. Please be advised that this episode does contain spoilers. I think that Judith Myers is one of the saddest deaths in horror, as she was the killer's sister. She died in her own home and could not have predicted what horror she would befall. I honestly don't think there was a way to avoid what happened, because Myers was just 6 years old and there was no way to tell that he had any of these ideas, and from what we see, there was no premeditation, and she was also home alone when this happened, which definitely upped the scare factor. I do, however, love the way this scene was shot, because we didn't know anything about the killer until he had taken the victim, other than the fact that he was familiar with the home and his victim. The nature in which she was killed, having just had sex with her boyfriend and was just wearing a pair of underwear, does bring me to a connection to my personal favorite horror movie, Scream, 1996. Randy Meek, a horror movie enthusiast, had a specific set of rules that one must follow in order to survive, one of which is do not have sex, which not only applies to this kill, but will apply later in this movie. So, something that I find interesting about this movie is how many different characters there are and how often things could have been prevented. So, a character that I personally really do not like in this movie is Samuel Loomis, who is Michael Myers' psychiatrist. So, at the very beginning of the movie, after Michael makes his first kill, we see Loomis and a nurse transporting to the psychiatric hospital where Myers has been for the past 15 years. And their goal is to pick him up and take him to court to see if he is going to go to a maximum security prison or if he's going to remain in the psychiatric hospital. Now, Loomis, having worked with Michael Myers for the past 15 years, knew that something was definitely very wrong with this guy, that he was a major danger to society. And yet he did not have a police escort. And I know that for any kind of prisoner transfer, there will always be police. And as someone who has actually spent time in a psychiatric hospital, I know that there are police there for our safety and for the safety of others. We also find out that he did admit to having denied any police security during the transfer. Something else that I find really interesting is how Myers was able to learn how to drive a car if he'd been locked up for 15 years. Because that is how he escaped, is he strangled and attacked the nurse who was driving the car. She got out and he got in and drove away. But I do think that it is important to note that his psychiatrist, Dr. Loomis, did immediately tell somebody instead of trying to cover it up like a lot of people would in horror movies. And that he did an investigation of his own. But a big red flag that comes on this investigation is that the graveyard keeper mentions that around Halloween kids are often defacing graves, but he doesn't seem to have reported this in the past. And when Loomis shows up to look at the grave of Judith Myers, he notices that the headstone is gone and the body and the coffin are gone, but no one said anything, which brings me to my next point about police not taking this kind of situation as a big deal. So I definitely feel like there's a stereotype in horror movies that, especially horror slashers, that the police never really believe what is going on is serious. I feel like the most notable exception of this is the cop in the first Scream, which is very rare. So Sheriff Beckett is Annie Beckett, one of the characters from the beginning of the movie's father. And at the very beginning, Annie and Lori are driving through town and they notice that there are police at a hardware store. And at the hardware store robbery, a Halloween mask, rope, and a couple of knives were stolen, but Sheriff Beckett basically blames it on kids, and Annie admits that he think that everything is to be blamed on kids. And we see that it's Myers who robbed the hardware store. So later that night, Sheriff Beckett and Dr. Loomis are going to explore the Myers home, which is currently up for sale. But they notice that there is a partially eaten dog that was still warm. And Sheriff Beckett's like, this is no big deal. It's probably a skunk. But Dr. Loomis points out that Myers is not human. He is characterized as an animal because he doesn't speak. He doesn't have morals. He doesn't feel any sort of remorse for what he's done. And there's a very simple solution to the problem, which is letting the community know that there is a killer on the loose, because that way they do not travel alone, they travel in groups. There is definitely safety in numbers in this kind of movie, as it's not a supernatural movie where the killer is a ghost or a vampire and cannot be killed in traditional ways. So I think that Dr. Loomis is really not for the protection of people. He's trying to cover his own track. And Sheriff Beckett even tries to say, I'm going to send my men out. Sheriff Beckett basically says, I'm going to call the radio station and the TV station so that we can get someone on this. However, Dr. Loomis immediately denies this and says, tell your men to keep their mouth shut, when there is a very simple solution, which is tell people even if they get upset. So one thing that was definitely done wrong at the beginning of this horror movie was the fact that Annie antagonizes the driver of the car, who happens to be Myers. And though they don't know it, even Laurie has a suspicion and tells Annie to stop, prompting Annie to tell her that she's crazy. But we found out very quickly that Laurie's actually the smart one. So the next part of the movie really focuses on Annie, who is babysitting Lindsay Wallace, 3 houses down from where Laurie is babysitting. And there's a scene where she's in the kitchen and she's talking to Laurie, and the dog starts barking, and Annie's brushing it off, saying the dog doesn't like me, dog's always barking, and tells Lindsay to come get her dog. But I think a big mistake made in horror movies is people not trusting animals. If an animal does not want to go inside of space or starts barking, even I know that something's wrong. And dog Lester actually gets outside and starts barking at Michael. And unfortunately, Michael kills the dog, but Annie chalks it up to the dog finally shuts up. Nothing's wrong, even though the dog let out a very loud whine before dying. And I really, really, really wish she had listened to the dog, because maybe she would have been saved. So one major mistake that I noticed was the entire sequence of this film where Annie was in the laundry room. First of all, going out alone in a bathroom. One major mistake that I noticed was the entire sequence of this film where she was in the laundry room. First of all, going out alone in a bathrobe is not always the smartest idea, especially in the middle of the night. The next mistake was that she fell through the door and was lucky that her boyfriend had called Lindsay, who went to find her. But the biggest mistake was that she did not lock the door behind her when she went back into the house. So throughout this entire sequence, Myers kept appearing in the doorway, but decided not to strike, and Annie was lucky, to say the least. She was lucky, but she made so many stupid mistakes. One thing that anyone who wants to survive a horror movie should know is always lock your windows and doors, because it takes time for the killer to break through the door, giving you time to get away. So I do have to say, Annie's death is definitely connected to the sex rule of Scream, because she is having a sexual conversation with her boyfriend on the phone, and Michael's hearing it. We don't know that or rather, Annie doesn't know that we're hearing this, but I think it's super, super interesting that this can actually be connected back to another movie. And I do love the Scream is a commentary on horror movies. But I will give Annie credit where credit is due. Because as soon as she realized she was in danger, she honked the horn of her car, and the quick thinking was something that not a lot of horror movie characters do. I cannot say that a lot of horror movie characters make this smart decision. So I think she had the right idea, but unfortunately, she could not be saved. All right, so another major mistake was made by Linda and Bob, who walked into Annie's house, and their first mistake was not walking away when they noticed that nobody was home and that it was eerily dark, but instead they were focused on making out with each other. Okay. So Linda Van Dyke and Bob Sims were the next victims of Myers, and they made so many mistakes. Their first was walking into Annie's house, seeing that it was completely dark, that nobody was home, and deciding, hey, we're gonna go turn out all the lights and go make out on the couch. If I walk into someone's home expecting them to be there and it's dark, I am walking out of there as fast as I can. So the second they let their guard down, they were screwed. Another rule in the book of Randy Meek is don't drink or do drugs, which after about 2 seconds of looking at these two characters, the audience can clearly see that they are drunk. The second they realized there were no people, they should have gotten back into their car and driven far, far away. And their decision to turn out the lights was definitely not a smart one because they were distracted. And I know for me personally, I am more likely to react to movement than I am to sound because I am always wearing my headphones. So if I see a shadow, I will jump. I will get help. If I notice anything's wrong, I am getting out of there. One of my favorite rules that Randy actually has is don't ever say I'll be right back. Because no character who has ever said I'll be right back comes right back. And Bobby makes this mistake. And, pardon me, Bob very quickly makes this mistake and says, I'll be right back. The second he separates himself from his girlfriend, he dies at the hand of the boogeyman. While this was one of the more difficult kills to have escaped, if he hadn't been alone, there would have been a fighting chance that at least one of the characters could have made it. The fact that he was opening random doors definitely made me feel quite on edge because that's just a thing that you're not supposed to do. I feel like that's pretty common knowledge, especially in a stranger's home. Well, I guess Annie wasn't a stranger, but still, if it's not your house, don't go looking around. It's just not a good thing to do. Alright, so we then focus back on Linda, who definitely had a higher chance here. The first clue was that she should have noticed was that when Bob walked back into the room, he had a sheet covering his head, had 2 eye holes, and was wearing glasses. But she didn't listen to her sense of something was off, because when we look at the characters, when the audience is looking at this specific character, we notice that she definitely feels a bit off. And if she had realized that sooner, I think she could have had a slight fighting chance, even though she did not have a weapon. But I do feel bad for Lori in this situation because when she's being choked, rather when Linda's being choked, Lori thinks that Annie is just joking around. Because in the past we definitely see that she tries to scare Lori. So even though I don't necessarily believe that this would have saved her, I think it would have given her time to alert the authorities that something was definitely wrong. In a very rare horror movie moment, the sheriff, upon hearing Samuel Loomis, who I've been skeptical of this entire movie, had found the car that his patient had stolen, actually makes a plan of action for both characters. They decide to split it up, which, again, don't do that. But one of them had a car and the other one knew Myers pretty well. They decided to go in opposite directions toward the block where the car is. in order to be able to give that element of surprise. Okay, so one character that I think I really, really want to touch up on and really emphasize is Laurie Strode, who is a very smart teenager from the beginning of the movie. At first, she notices Myers standing outside of the house he once lived and killed in, but did not alert anyone as she had no idea who he was. She then noticed that the car he was driving and could tell. So I think that Laurie Strode is a very, very smart teenager right from the beginning of the movie. She first notices Myers standing outside of the house he once lived and killed in, but did not alert anyone as she had no clue who he was. She then noticed that the car that drove by her was being driven by someone they knew, or I think that Laurie Strode. Okay. I think that Laurie Strode is a very smart teenager right from the beginning of this movie. At first, she notices Myers standing outside of the house he once lived and killed in, but did not alert anyone as she had no clue who he was. When a car drove past her and her friends, Annie thought it was someone they knew. It was a car that belonged to someone they knew, but Laurie did not have a good feeling. And from then on out, she was definitely on high alert, which allowed her to make better decisions than most characters would have made. So I was definitely impressed by that. I also think that she was smart in the way that she hid herself as fast as possible at the beginning to avoid eye contact with the creep. There were definitely some closer calls at the beginning, especially when she went to Annie's house to look for her friends. I also think something that was difficult about surviving this movie was that the bodies get moved by Michael Myers, making it difficult for the other characters to see that there was a problem and call the police. I sincerely wish that she had called the police to check on her friends instead of going alone and leaving the kids she was babysitting on their own. And by the time that she reached upstairs, it was too late and she was trapped in the house. The resulting minutes leave Laurie having the absolute fight of her life. The first smart decision she made is to lock the door to the kitchen, giving herself time while the killer had to break down the door. She bravely broke the glass, escaping the home she was locked in, giving her time to run to a neighbor's house. The resulting minutes leave Laurie having the absolute fight of her life. The first smart decision she makes is to lock the door to the kitchen, giving herself time while the killer had to break down the door. She bravely broke the glass, escaping the home she was locked in, giving her time to run to a neighbor's house to try and get help. She then ran to Tommy's house, and after realizing she didn't have the keys, was able to get his attention by smashing a flower pot against his window. For reference, Tommy is one of the two kids that Laurie was babysitting at the time. She then tried to call 911, but the lines were cut, and after she realized it was too late, the window was open, and Laurie quickly tried to call 911, but the lines were cut, and she realized after it was too late that the window was open, so she armed herself with a knitting needle. This decision left her able to stab Myers in the neck and knock him unconscious. She then hides in a closet where he attacks again. She then tried to call 911, but the lines were cut, and she realized after it was too late that the window was open, so she armed herself with a knitting needle. She was able to successfully stab Myers in the neck and render him unconscious. However, she quickly realized that he wasn't and was able to get herself into a closet. Unfortunately, Myers broke through very quickly, and she used a coat hanger to stab him in the eye and then stab him with his own knife. But somehow, she knows that there's a possibility of another attack. So she sends the two kids off to a neighbor's home to get help. Just as things are looking extremely bleak for Laurie, Dr. Loomis appears in the house with a gun, takes aim, and shoots Michael Myers in the head several times, causing him to fall off the balcony, seemingly to his death. Before he falls, we do see his face, which confirms that the killer is Michael Myers. Unfortunately, he does not end up dying and disappears into the night. And I will say that Lindsay Wallace and Tommy Doyle are the two luckiest characters in horror movie history because the amount of times they've had encounters with Michael Myers and didn't die is incredible. That concludes this week's episode of A Survivor's Guide to Horror. I would love to hear all of your questions and, of course, any suggestions you might have for these characters. That concludes this week's episode of A Survivor's Guide to Horror. I would love to hear all of your questions and, of course, any suggestions that you might have for these characters. You can reach out at a.survivors.guide.2.horror@gmail.com or on Instagram at a_survivors_guide_2_horror. I will always appreciate a rating and a text review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I will see you next week on another episode of A Survivor's Guide to Horror.